So Vue.js, or Vue, unlike Angular, there still is only one thing called Vue. You know, Angular.js, Angular, Mangular, you know, Frustratular. You know, I tease it, but I use it all the time. So Vue is another technology, and this technology was written as a direct reaction to someone who was learning JavaScript through Angular.js, which I kind of find humorous. So Vue is another single-page JavaScript framework. The person who created its name is Evan You. I believe he's former, I have to double check this, but I believe he no longer works at Google. But when he was hired by Google, he was hired in something called the 5 Project, which was every year Google would hire 5 brand new right out of college students and put them up in a design team, an idea creating team. So they would have a designer, a coder, an idea person, a copywriter, and like a wild card. That's what they call it. So he was in there. He had graduated from a school of design and technology, Parsons. And his quote about why he went down this road was, first of all, he was experimenting with JavaScript. He didn't learn it from Parsons. He was learning all sorts of design theory and probably user experience and human factors and whatever else they taught him there. And while he was doing that, he said, well, I got to make something happen on the browser, so I'll use JavaScript. And he started experimenting, kind of like what the Chrome experiments team was doing, you know, throwing out ideas and experiments that were being created. So he was doing his own stuff. They recruited him, put him on this team. And then, of course, what they did was they said, oh, well, you know what? We've got this framework called AngularJS, prototype in AngularJS. And you can. I mean, I did a lot of prototyping, a lot of throwaway code, trying things out. It's not bad for prototyping, but he felt it was too heavyweight. So he said, I'm building my own framework. Like every open source developer, someone eventually says, I'm building my own. And out of the thousands that do it, 4 or 5 of them actually get through with it to the point where they open source it, and great. His comment was, what if, or I just figured, what if I could just extract the part I really liked about Angular, JS, because at the time, this is 2014, 13, and build something really lightweight without all the extra concepts involved. And end up with something as complex as React or Angular, which is what he did. But that was the goal, you know, make it simpler, perhaps. So you're going to see another variation on the same darn theme we saw before. We got an app. The app's got router to deal with views. Does that sound familiar by now? This will make my job easy. And it's got some sort of state management. So, you know, you could use, I suppose, Redux with it, but there's this thing called VueX. The team has built all 3 of these things. So the router, VueX, and Vue are all created by the Vue team, which is kind of nice. But they're different libraries that you opt into. And there's a whole bunch of other things out there. So the things you add to Vue when you want to add something other than components and the basic Vue technology is they're called mixins. And we're going to see those 2. We're going to see the router and the state management as 2 mixins we install. But there are other mixins out there for all sorts of things, like, for example, Semantic UI, which is a nice CSS component framework for buttons and widgets and panels and layouts. There's a Semantic UI Vue, and you install it as a mixin. You say, hey, Vue, I'm going to add Semantic UI to you. And suddenly it has all these extra tags available for Semantic UI. So that's how they do it. They have this little installer tool called Vue.add, I believe it is. All right. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the Vue instance itself. So when you mount Vue, you have to build one instance of the Vue engine and then attach it to something on the DOM. So this sounds really much like React, right? Fire it up, attach it to a root element of the DOM, and away we go. So we'll do that first. We'll just take a look at that quickly. Here's a Vue app. If you want to hold on to it later and do something with it, you hold on to the variable, like we're doing there with var app equals new Vue. If you're just launching it to start itself off, you can just say new Vue and attach it to the element, which is what you could also do here. So you don't necessarily need the var app unless something outside of it needs to talk to it. But the minute we do that, we say we're going to jump on and take over this #app div, and then we can set up properties. And the properties for a Vue app, notice, by the way, this is a a constructor that takes an object. They're kind of like Ruby on Rails that way. They have objects that get created by taking properties in them. And that means they can always extend the API by adding new properties to it, right? So that's their trick there. So we have, currently we're gonna look at these. So there's a data property, and the data property's job is to map out what will be reactive in the user interface, what will respond and redraw itself if changed by an event. Okay, so those are called data properties. And so you basically return a shape that it's now going to watch in the Vue instance. And what we're going to see later is we can break this down into further finer grained things called components. So it'll be very similar to this, but just a little more narrow in scope. You can have derived data that you just calculate based on changes to the data itself. So it's kind of summarized or, aggregated pieces of information. Those go in the computed properties. And those are just functions that run that operate on the data that you have. There are methods. The methods are what get triggered by the user interface when you click an event. So they're going to end up being methods on the class, on the object, I should say. Don't want to use the word class. They're going to be methods on the object, and those can be accessed by the template, by a click event or a mouse drag or a key up or key down. Then there's filters, and filters are a lot like the pipes that Rich Friedman talked about in Angular. Same deal. You can send something through a filter to format it nicely. And so they make those real easy to install too. And there's other things as well, but those are kind of the primary things that we'll look at. So I'm going to put this mic down. Everyone's like, thank God he stopped talking. But no, I'm going to keep going. All right, so there's no escape, people. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to fire up. I don't know if I've actually fired it up. Indeed, I probably have not. This is where it all grinds to a halt for 30 seconds. All right, demo. Let me fire something up here. Server port equals. Oh. It would help if I picked the right port. There we go. Be prepared for a really dumb example, but I wanted to give you a really simple one where you can see everything in process. All right. One of the things they tried to do with Vue and what they liked about Angular JS was you could just load a script. So this thing here, I'm going to show you, is an app written in Vue on a single HTML page. The trick is you've got the script, loads up the Vue.js library. I just downloaded that and threw it in the directory. Then you have some div you're going to take over. So there's the app div we're going to take over. And in that one, you see the template. Golly, doesn't that look a little bit like Angular? It does, because Angular is based on the syntax of AngularJS with some changes. Evan apparently really didn't like where Angular was headed, so he created his own changes to the AngularJS templates, and he also has weird characters in front of them, like an @ sign. There's no escape from trying to figure this stuff out. And by the way, if you're curious why Angular has parentheses around its events and brackets around its properties, it's because they were trying to find a way for developer tooling to identify what's a property versus an event, so they could give the IDEs some code fill-in help. So when you hit Control Space in the parentheses, it says, oh, I'm going to look for the methods. And if you go to the brackets, oh, I'm going to look for a property on the object instance. That's why they did it. So the same deal happens here, but they made it a little bit lighter. So this template here is for listing a group of sessions, and it's really a dumb example, but that's why I just made it simple. And every time you click on add, it adds a random session to a list. Ooh, that's exciting. But it serves our purposes. So let's look at the template and try to interpret what it's doing. So we're going to create our header. We then have a button in there that will call a function called add random session. That's our event. And the way you wire an event is use @ and the name of the event. Now you can write your own events. You can emit events from your components and pick them up. Or these are the standard DOM events like click, mouse move, that kind of thing. So later on in this file, you'll see in the methods, there's an add random session function. Then we're iterating through the sessions variable in the instance of Vue and saying, give me each one as a variable called session and make each one an li. Inside of there, we show an expression, which is a session ID dash and a nicely formatted date using a function called format datetime, which is a filter. So you're going to see the filter in there. Okay, to build this thing, and by the way, I don't think I even need the var app, but I'll try that later. We create a new Vue instance. And the new Vue instance hooks into the app, #app, that's the ID of app on the page. So that's the div with the ID of app right here. Make that a little larger. Here we go. We also have, and I'm just going to minify a few things here, minimize a few things so we don't look at them yet. We also have data. Data just needs to tell the rough shape of the objects that are going to be watched. And what you're doing is establishing these points that it's going to pay attention to. So for example, it now knows the data has a property called sessions, which is an array. Now it's watching the array. That will actually be a property of the object called sessions. It's not data.sessions, it's just called sessions. But what they do is they wrap it with a proxy around it. So every property it has that you reference in here is wrapped with a get and set. Anyone ever use object.define property in JavaScript? A few people? Just so you know, and half of you probably or more don't know this yet, but JavaScript has had the ability to have getters and setters of properties for, I don't know, 10 plus years. So the object.define property, you can say that I have a regular old property, but it's actually backed by a function to set it or a function to query it, but you access it like it's a regular old property. They're doing that. They're wrapping everything that you have in data with these get and set methods, and they're hiding it behind those things so they can detect when you change by adding something or changing something in the collection. So that's what's happening. If you debug this thing, you'd see object proxies everywhere. Okay, so we've got this array. I've set it up with a default set of sessions just for playing around, so something would show up in the UI, but it could just be an empty object. It doesn't really matter what it is. And then I have my method. I'm not paying attention to the event, but I could, like the actual event data, but I'm actually letting a button trigger this function. That's all I'm really using it for here. So event is there, but we're not doing much with it. In fact, what I'll do is I'll do a console.dir of it. Anyone know what console.dir is? This is a really useful utility in the console. It's the one that prints out like an actual openable hierarchical thing to describe an object as opposed to just a string. So when you're debugging in Chrome, console.dir will give you like a snapshot of the object at the time that it did it. It's really useful for debugging purposes and seeing what's going on. It's in Chrome, I believe it's also in Edge and Firefox now too. What we're doing in here is a little bit of plain old JavaScript. We're going through the collection of sessions and we're calling reduce on it. And we're just basically counting and we're looking for the highest key. So as long as the key is lower than the current highest key, we don't do anything with it. But every time we get the next highest key, we keep bumping up the accumulator to that key. So at the end, we're left with the highest number in the IDs of the sessions. And then we just add 1 to it. So now we have a new key. That's just cheating because I don't have a database. So this is my database. Right. And then I'm just going to use a push on sessions to add the new object. And I just use math.random around the date. Date.now is the number of time ticks since January 1st, 1970, and plus a large random number gives me some time roughly in the future. So hence in the UI, these are roughly future dates. Okay. Now for the filters are just functions that take a thing and return a thing. The return thing should be a string of some sort for formatting. So that's actually pretty easy. What I do, and I used to do this with Angular JS filters and with pipes, is I also just check for sanity. Did you actually pass me something before I go and try to do a format of the string? And by the way, was it a date? Because if you didn't, I'm just going to hand you back what you gave me. I'm not messing with it. So this is like a fail fast but fail without blowing up filter. It just says fine, I'm not doing anything, I'm just going to give you what you gave me. But if you give me a date, I'm going to call toDate string on it and I'm going to return it. All right. Now, computeds. I have a really dumb, simple computed value example. I want to show how many sessions there are, and all it is just taking the array and doing a length on it. So I have a computed in here, and it's called num sessions. I'm also using a little feature built into Vue that I want to advise you not to overuse. It's the message bus feature built into Vue. You can emit and subscribe to messages sent from different parts of the app. AngularJS had that, and the semantics are identical, which tells me that he really liked it. You know, he just incorporated the same thing. It's called $emit and $on, and there was $broadcast because we had hierarchical scopes in AngularJS. I doubt that's there. But what happens is if I find out that I've got more than 10, I just do something silly. I send a message that says, we're over the limit. So I'm using the message bus, and then otherwise I just return the length. In the created, this function called created is one of the lifecycle methods a Vue instance can have. And the idea is when the component, or in this case, the whole Vue instance has been finished, created, and wired up, I have a callback. And in React and Angular all have these callbacks. So they just make these methods that you can wire up to the Vue instance. And there's one for created, one for before it's destroyed, when it's updated, that kind of thing. So they all exist and they're all documented. And in the created, all I'm doing is I'm doing a this.$on. By the way, this is the Vue instance. Same thing with in the computed, this is the Vue instance. And by the way, notice I don't have to mess with anything to get to this keyword. In Vue, your functions attached as properties of features like a computed or a created or a data, they don't need and they shouldn't be arrow functions because they automatically bind this for you. So you don't have to think about the this keyword. So actually make your life a little easier. That was one of the things he was trying to avoid, was having people have to do arrow functions and things like that around saving the this parameter. Now, that said, I'm sure I can run into 5 or 6 situations where I still use an arrow function, but not at the first level, not at that first initial num sessions level. It's going to be a function. Okay. You'll see them later when we start talking about VueX for state management. I'll use a few arrow functions in there. But for the outermost thing, I usually use a plain old function. All right, and that's it. That's the app. Pretty straightforward. Any questions about that so far? Okay, so that's the Vue instance. And that's all we really need for a small Vue app. And so it shares with React and with AngularJS before to a degree. It shares the concept of a really lightweight start. If you want to add Vue to an app, go ahead. It's not a big deal to add it. And you can have multiple little Vue apps onto a page if you want to, just attaching to different elements. Okay. Where is my browser? There. Okay, now let's look at components. It's going to be a variation on the theme. Because components are just like mini applications. They're smaller scoped things. So they hold state. This sounds familiar, right? So they hold state in the data property. They get defined. And it's the same deal. Almost. I'll show you why. They can accept incoming parameters. In my SPA demo that I did, I have like the React team did, I was using the session link. I stole that directly from you, thank you. And I had to have an excuse for actually getting parameters in and out. So I'm like, okay, I'll pass the information to render a link into one and bring a param in. So I can show you that. They could emit events to the parent, so you can have a toolbar or something that sends an event upward that a parent can subscribe to and do something with, but I'm not showing that here. They'll define their own methods. We already saw that before. There's going to be a methods property, and we're going to put functions in there. And then you wire methods to DOM events, guess how, with the @ sign and the name of the event, just like we saw earlier. So you already almost know everything you need to know to create a Vue component. And of course, now they contain their own templates. So there's going to be a property called template. We also have styling, and you'll see we can style a number of different ways. That's using something called a single file component. And we'll talk about those in a couple minutes. All right. So you could globally, for the entire Vue script object, you could globally register a component. This is kind of ridiculously global, because that means that anywhere on the page I can access the alert Maybe you have some of those. So this is the highest level if I want to wire this component in everywhere. The component I'm wiring is called alert. It takes one property coming in called message. And so now anywhere I can mount angle bracket alert, message equals, and an expression, and it will render a template with a div of alert and print it out. So pretty small to get a component going, but that we don't need to mount it at the global level, but we'll start there. Okay, so now I have a reusable component that I can put anywhere in the template of any smaller component or the app itself. Here's an example of using it. So what you see here is we register our component globally, just like we saw, and then we create a small miniature component that just has a template in it to start things off. Remember how they were talking about like the little tiny component that bootstraps everything else? That's what the app thing is there. It's just a component that has a property called template. And that's all it's for, is to bootstrap the application. That thing's going to take over the app div, and in it, it's going to mount the alert. And now look at this binding there. The plus around message, or the colon around message, I haven't showed that yet. There it is. Right? That is an input binding. So if you want to have a binding that changes when the data changes that's assigned to it, you can use the colon in front of the variable name. So @ is for events, and colon is for inward bindings, properties. And it works. The only little other thing we haven't really talked about is when you boot Vue in kind of a system where you're going to have multiple components, your first component gets rendered. So there's a function called render where you manually call the method that renders it. And it's a weird syntax, but it basically says if you give a render property to your Vue instance, it's going to expect it to be a function that takes one parameter. And I've seen different names for it. In this example, I have Vue, another one you see H for HTML, but it's just a function that renders. And it renders a component. So the Vue function from Vue says, I will take this, I will render a component, and then it will be attached to the element. Similar to React create object, what is it called? Create element, yes, where you attach the DOM node to some JSX. All right, so that's building a component globally and then using it from an app. Now, another way to define a component, and the one that's becoming pretty popular, feels a little weird at first, but then when the tooling works, you start liking it, is something called a single file component. And the idea is that the template and the script and the styles are all put together in one file. It looks weird at first, but then when you have like IntelliJ or Visual Studio Code or even Sublime Text understanding Vue single file components, it'll actually code complete in all the different sections for you. That's weird looking. But up top here we have the template for this file. We have the script, which is the component definition for that file. And it will need to have an element to attach to. And whatever we're allowed to put in a component goes in there. By the way, your imports would go right above it. So it's like your script is just in the middle of this file. And in IDEs, it'll actually code complete your imports and everything. So it's kind of a weird thing, but it works great. And then you can have styles attached. Now, by default, the styles are global. We'll see how to namespace them like you guys were talking about in Angular and React. But notice the file has to end in .vue. You import it as file name .vue. And what happens is Webpack has a Vue compiler that splits the three parts out, compiles the CSS into the right part in Webpack, compiles the JavaScript with Babel, or TypeScript if you've installed that, and then takes the template and puts it in with Webpack to wherever the templates go. Now, we can also say, you know what? I want the language for this style sheet to be Sass, SCSS. And in that case, I have full access to Sass. And that means I can do variables and put them someplace else in my script. I can even preload variables in a global set of scripts. So one thing that the other frameworks don't have that I hope they get soon, because I really like how this went, is the ability, I just have to find my code, the ability to wire in, 1 second here. Wire into Webpack. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to bring up, I'll bring it up on the screen in a second. All right. That was not what I expected. There we go. So, didn't want to delay too long. There's a thing called the vue.config.js file. When in the root of the project, if you create a vue.config.js file, it lets you manipulate the Webpack config without ejecting the project to a full-blown Webpack project. That is a huge help. And what I'm doing in the project I'm giving you guys at the end of this thing is I'm setting up a couple things. First of all, I'm pointing a proxy so that when you hit a particular URL in our application or a particular path, if it's not found, it will go to another server. Spring Boot, JavaScript, Happy, whatever the end backend server is. So when I do an AJAX call, I'm going to point to the path on my local server. It won't find it, and the proxy will kick in and it will go to the other server. And there's other ways to configure the proxy, but that's one thing I'm doing in this app, so I can hook into a backend without a lot of extra configuration. And I'll show you that when we get to the AJAX. Then, I'm also saying run the server on port 8081. That's another Webpack directive that you have to give it. This is the port I'm running on. And by default, I think it picks like 8,000 or something. Then I'm saying I want to customize the loaders for CSS. And what I'm saying is for the CSS loader, I'm giving it a loader options, and I'm saying for a Sass compiler for Node Sass, which is what it automatically recognizes, I want you to add an additional snippet of CSS to import my global styles. So you can set up global styles, global mix-ins, whatever you want to do, and put them in an external file, and you just do that in this little tiny Vue config.js file, and it takes care of it. And now in your actual components, you can refer to those variables, and it works great. So I know I'm doing it here, but if that was in the actual globals that I set up, that'd be available to me. It's a really nice feature of the Vue CLI and the Webpack config thereof. So yeah, it goes without saying, to do any single file components, you need Webpack. So you need a project that is installed the single file compiling loader or plugin. Okay, now just like we talked about in these other frameworks, Angular by default namespaces all of its components, right? It adds an additional attribute to each component to make them unique, and then all the styles have the same attribute on them so that the styles don't bleed outward from that component. If I want that, all I have to do is put the word scoped at the end of my style tag, does it automatically. So that takes care of that. Apparently they've got some competition going with the React team because they were like, all right, well, we can also do modules. So they just added CSS module support as well. And so the deal is, whenever you say module, you get a special variable called styles. And apparently you don't just have to use classes. You can use variables from the, the exported variables, like a color or a mix-in or something, and you can actually inject it directly. So there's a lot of power to this stuff. And all I know is I looked at that and said, cool, when I have some time, I'm gonna play with this more. But the bottom line is we have two approaches. The easiest one is scopes because you have to do 0 things and it acts just like it does in Angular. And you get the namespacing outward. There's nothing that will collide outside of this component tree. So for example, if I'm setting up a table width, the only things that would get that table width would be anything inward. And the trick is when you style it, put a class on it, right? So you'll have a class on it and it will be namespaced, and so hopefully that's unique enough in your tree. But if you don't want to have to worry about that, you can switch to the modules mode and directly inject the $styles.name, and that will absolutely be only for that component and nothing else. So if you're building a widget library, you want to do date pickers and things like that, and you want very precise control and you don't want it to bleed deeper or outward, you should look at CSS module support. And in the slides, I found a good blog article today. I was looking around for some good references for you. This is excellent. There's a really good document on the differences between the two and how they work. And so for now, I'm punting a little bit, but I figured I'd give you some resources to read up on for that. All right. Changing data, right? One way to do it was through created. So for example, when the component boots up, we say we're going to have a shape of data that has a message property. And by default, it'll start as hello, if I wanted to set that. And then in the created, I say, well, let's just go to sleep for 4 seconds. And this is just something where I would use the arrow function now because now I'm paranoid that this is going to go away. And I'm pretty sure I had to do that to get it to work. Because for synchronous stuff, the function declaration here makes this just fine. But the minute I do a set timeout, I'm probably going to lose the this. See, the biggest little dirty secret of JavaScript programming is when you start going async a couple levels deep, you're going to end up using arrow functions and or other mechanisms to bind to this keyword. It's just ugly. So I'm doing the arrow function to protect the this keyword when I go to sleep for 4 seconds. But what's happening is I go to sleep, 4 seconds later, I set message on the component. And then because of reactivity, the proxy gets tripped. It says, oh, we've got to reload the page or redraw the div because now the text has changed. And it automatically updates. So if you were to look at this thing once it gets set up and before the timeout, you'd see that the object property called message here would be a proxy to the string, not the string itself. And then when you change it, it goes through the proxy and says, I got to clean up. That's what's going on. Back to events. Let's say we're doing the Facebook poke, right? Dumbest tool in the world. Doink, 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 doink. Leave me alone. So I've got @click here. @click we'll call poke. Poke is a method in the methods property. That's it. Just bump up the count and it automatically reacts if I have data returning a poke count. I've got to define that poke count for it to see it. Whether it's this is a simple primitive, but it could be an object too with properties, and that also works. Incidentally, the biggest thing you can do to accelerate your knowledge of any of these frameworks is write a lot of little throwaway examples outside of your code base. I wanted to mention this because I find that people try to reason about really complicated APIs in their code right now for their sprint, and they make a hopeless mess out of their code. And I do that too. So let's just start with a, yes, I'm Ken and I destroy my own code base, right? We all do it. But the best thing you could do is write a throwaway. Do I understand this feature well enough to, inflict it on my code base? And so there are a couple of websites that I like. Code Sandbox is one, and I put a few links in here for some samples. There was another one, and I'm having something Blitz, stackblitz.io. That's the one that the Angular team likes. So those are two. And the nice part about both of those is they actually do it in NPM projects. So you can download the project to do an NPM install, and you've got a Create React app, or you've got a Vue app from Vue CLI, or an Angular app from Angular CLI, and it works with your tooling. Pretty great. Anyway, side note. Forms in Vue I wanted to briefly mention before I move on. So forms, they have stolen directly a concept from Angular, which is the bidirectional, it's Angular and AngularJS, the bidirectional form bindings for fields. They have this thing called vModel. It is directly stolen from AngularJS. AngularJS had an ng-model property, and you would give it the name of an object in what they called a scope, but basically in your object instance, and it would keep it up to date. If I type in the field, it would update the model. If I updated the model in code, it would update the field. That's what vModel does. So here we have a form that has a submit event, and incidentally, that submit.prevent, that's called an event modifier. Certain types of events have an optional modifier you can attach to them by doing .modifier, and you can chain them on. So one of them is .prevent. It will prevent it from doing the default behavior. In a form, the default behavior is to go to a server, which would completely defeat the point of a single page app because it would leave the app. So in React, for example, you would get the event and call prevent default. That's what it's doing here. So we're preventing it from posting the form to the server like a regular old web form. Beyond that, I'm just using HTML5 validations required, so if I can't submit the form without typing those in, and that will be browser dependent. I've not dug so deeply into the Forms API to know where the warts are, but these are the basics. I also gave you a select here to show you how to fill in a collection. It's going to use a v4. All right, so the v4 directive lets me iterate through like we saw earlier. And v4 can give two properties: the actual value of the collection element and the index counter of it. And so you sometimes need that for certain things where you're iterating through them to provide a key. And this is just like React. React wants a key when you iterate through things with a map or something. Same thing with Vue. So it's weird. This is like a mashup of both. It's like if AngularJS, Angular, and React all got into the octagon, and one of them came out alive, it would probably look like maybe Vue, or at least one of them would crawl away as Vue, and one would crawl away as something else, Reangular or something. Who knows? Anyway, all right, that's silly. I'm sorry. Threw that one right off the bridge. Vue router. This is a quick one. So the Vue router is the router developed by the Vue team, and it has navigational management. So it's going to just be like the React router and the Angular router. It shares more with the Angular router in that you do it in code. Right? So you set it up in code. And so there's a router class. Now, let's talk mixins. Vue.use, you can give it the name of a constructor, a thing they build. This is a constructor function. That's the router constructor. And so when you say Vue.use on router, you install the router features in Vue. Almost. You have one more thing you have to do is actually inject the instance of the config. So the first thing we do is we tell Vue, hey, wire yourself up to work with this feature. Then we create a new router object, which takes a series of props, one of which is routes. And the routes is just an array of routes, just like we saw in other routers. Same deals we saw in the other ones. You can redirect from one place to another. You can route to a particular component. You can have a path. You can have nested routers. All that stuff exists for the Vue router. All right. Next, you have to actually physically give it the router config. And this is the weirder part. So when you create the Vue instance, one of the properties will just be router. That is shorthand in ECMAScript 2015 for router:_router. Whenever you have an object with a bunch of key and value pairs, in the most recent versions of JavaScript, if you just want a property with the name of the variable as the key and the data of the variable as the value, you just use it by itself. First time you see it, it drives you nuts. After a while, it becomes just second nature when you're doing JavaScript. But this is saying, give me a property called router with the config I just built. That, plus doing the, learn how to use my stuff here, plus the Vue use will set up the router, and now it's active. That's it. Now, to use it, we have elements that it's installed for you. So they've created Vue components for you called router link and router outlet. Router link does what it sounds like. Router link is going to provide a link for you, and there are attributes for that for all sorts of different features. Here's two really simple static links to home and to registration. Router outlet is where am I going to render the router. All right. And so you can nest routers as well. I haven't done this yet. It's one of the things on my list as I start thinking about a Vue class, is to like exercise the API more. But at a bare minimum, this will get you started. So basically, wherever this is, that's where the routes show up. A couple other examples. So maybe I've got, a path that includes a variable. That's doable. I'm going to use that in the sample. I can say I want to go to register, and by the way, pass it an ID, which is one of these data variables for my current instance. That's fine too. So you have a lot of options here. They also have a programmatic ability to access the router. So there's a $router that's automatically on the this of every component. And you can do things like, push to another route and that kind of thing. So you can programmatically route to different places. And as we'll see later, any routed to component has a $route, which is all of its parameters. So it'd be this.$route.params.blah will give my parameter. So they give you those through the mixin. The mixin is what makes those things happen, the Vue.use of router coupled with the actual instance of the router data. Okay, how much time do I have? 15 minutes? 0 minutes? No one's looking. 2 minutes? It's 1:30. Okay, 1:40, it's my schedule, I don't remember. That's how bad I am at scheduling. Okay, well that's fine. I got a couple more seconds till I start impeding on Jeff's life. So let me talk about VueX briefly, if I can. VueX is the Redux-ish thing for Vue. So it's a state management library, maintains status and object graph. This is going to also sound familiar. Dispatches actions to request state changes, also sounds like Redux, except they have the thing that does the changes. It's not a reducer function. It's a series of functions you can call, and they're called mutations, like a zombie library or something. But you call methods, and those methods can manipulate the state tree. There's another state library that React people are using called MobX. This has more in common with MobX than it does with Redux. So there's the shape of it. You can do a vue.use of VueX. You then create the new VueX store, give it the properties you need, like state, actions, mutations, maybe some helper methods to find things called getters. And then just like the router, you have to inject the store config as well. So what we just built was a store. So if I was exporting that as storeconf.js, right? Then I could import that as storeconf.js, import the default variable store and place it in my Vue config. By the way, I kind of jumped over that with the router. I did the same thing there. My router config was exported as a variable. I imported it and put it in the Vue instance. Same pattern. Okay. I will not go through this right now because we're running out of time. So I'm just going to jump to the wrap up, and then we'll talk later, like at the end of this whole thing at 4:15 when we do the panel discussion. We'll briefly talk about the repository and how you can look at all the code and run it and take a look at it. So I'll defer some of that stuff till then. So in short then, Vue single-page components are kind of a nice take on encapsulating everything in one place. It's also, VueX doesn't at least feel as complicated as Redux at first. What I found was the problem with VueX was that even though it should work, sometimes it doesn't. And it doesn't because you don't quite understand it. With Redux, it's very easy. If you screw up, you're not getting anything back, and it's probably because you didn't replace the object. With VueX, think that way anyway. Whatever you're mutating, replace it, and it will work great. But if you try to just directly change things in place, certain operations don't get detected by the change detection. So I tend to create objects, using like ... and brackets around to create a new array out of an old one and adding one to it. I do things like that. And it's because the way that VueX works, it detects certain operations, but not all operations, and that can get confusing. So while I would love to say to you that Vue is a great alternative to Angular or to React and to Redux, I would say it's not without its own warts and its own weirdness. I'm still learning them, and I'm kind of probably doing overkill to make my app work. And I'm at the point now where I'm going to start paring down the ones, because it took hours to debug the problems. The exceptions are bad. They don't really give you a lot of good information when things fail. So they're not a mature framework like a React or an Angular where you get at least a decent idea of what happened. Sometimes you're left, last night I was debugging a problem for 3 hours. And it was one little tiny missing symbol. But the exception, there was no exception, just kept resubmitting the page over and over again, like rerouting. And I had no idea why. And that to me is unexcusable for a framework. So it has a way to go for maturing, right? And that's in my weaknesses. But from the strengths to finish up then, TypeScript support is there, testing support is there. They have a unit testing with Jest. I don't think Enzyme, but definitely Jest. And they have a bunch of different, in the CLI, a bunch of different ways of installing test APIs for the web. I think Nightwatch and a couple of others. And the dev tools are really nice. I was playing around with that application a minute ago. See if I can pull up the app for 1 second and then I'll get off the stage. All right, here's the app. Here's the Vue developer tools. So first of all, Vue has a nice little hierarchical browser. This also looks familiar, doesn't it? So it's the same kind of thing. You can look through and see objects. I think the React one's superior because it has the profile built into it and things like that. It also includes the VueX state machine manager in the same plugin. So if I jump from place to place, I have to actually do something here. So demo b demo at user.com, and we're gonna, well, that sounds painful. I'm going to, and same deal, right? So you can time travel to the different states. It's a more simple version of what you guys have in that really awesome Redux plugin. But you can do things like you can export the state and replay it, that kind of thing. Take a look at things, filter the state. So it's a decent plugin. There's also a thing called slots, and slots are just nice for if you want to have stuff coming in like a header, a footer, the content of an element. They're sent in as slots. So you can basically have stuff inside the tag of your component. You can even mark them as those things like header and footer and such. And then in the template, you can say, I want this to go in this slot in the template. And there's a default slot for the whole body if you don't decorate with anything. All right, I'm already past my time. So beyond that, weaknesses, no built-in service layer. So it's more like React in that way. They figure out your own problem, do it yourself. No dependency injector, really. So I guess plugins would probably be the way to inject something like that and build your own DI. There's a really obnoxious level of linting going on. If you have ES, and you're smiling because I know where you're going with your talk. The linter is obnoxious. For example, no semicolons to terminate a statement, but a trailing comma at the end of everything. No. That's weird to me. Now, other developers would be like, yeah, Ken, you're a dummy. And that's just the way the JavaScript industry and every other industry is. Right? We argue about spaces versus tabs. But I found that there are so many rules in the default linting rules that they're kind of obnoxious. It's the first thing I turn off. And then if I was doing a real project in it, I would turn on a good set of them to say what Jeff was about to tell me when I sit down. All right, so I think I'm done. Any questions before I get down there? All right, good enough. So that's Vue. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to have Jeff come up, Jeff Lebonsky, and he's going to talk about server stuff in JavaScript. So give us a couple minutes and we'll get that started. Thank you.